All right, John chapter 8, verse 12. We've been talking about the I am statements that Christ has been making. And I haven't been going one right after another as it goes in Scripture, just this fluid line. I've been jumping a little bit back and forth, and I've done that for a particular reason. This morning we're going to talk about where Christ says, I am the light. I am the light. And I wonder sometimes, do we really understand the depth of what he means when he says, I am the light? So the best way I can try and illustrate that was I was reading something really interesting this week, and there was these group of guys, and they decided for one guy's birthday they were having a birthday party. Nothing inappropriate going on, just guys getting together being guys. So they're hanging out on this houseboat, and they decide, as guys do, hey, let's go out and see if we can't paddle out into the ocean. Smart move, right? Yeah, smart move. And so the group of guys with, 2 paddle boards and some floaties, grown men in floaties, if you can picture that, they're floating down, and they get about 30 minutes out away from where they started. And these are rough, manly men, right? These are guys that you look at, and they're just rough and tough and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, the biggest and toughest one of them all, he kind of tries to get up on the floaty as best as he can, and he starts screaming. Not this manly yell, okay? I'm talking about that high-pitched squeal that comes out of someone when they're afraid. And he starts screaming, and he's yelling, shark, shark, shark. And the look on his face tells you that he is truly, truly afraid. So the rest of the men that are all gathered around said, well, if this guy, the biggest and toughest of us all, he's scared, and they start looking around, and they see this dorsal fin in the water like this. And all of a sudden, you know it, if you grew up this way, you hear that sound go off in your head. Doo-doo, 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 automatically. But then all of a sudden, one of the guys, he looks a little bit closer, and he says, no, calm down. That's not a shark, it's a dolphin. So this calm kind of goes over the entire group. And what they expected to be this man-eating shark was just a dolphin that just wanted to play with them, right? And sometimes we have this picture of God where we think he just wants to come down and crash down on me. When really what he wants to do is just come close. He wants to come close and experience life with you. And more than that, he wants you to experience life with him. So when Jesus says, I am the light, do we really grasp the idea of why Christ came into the world and why he says, I am the light? We started out with the statement where Christ says, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. And what he's saying there is saying, you know what? I am. I am always present. I am Yahweh God. I am Jehovah. Who you see, who your fathers worshipped, I am. Which caused a lot of problems. We talked about that. We moved into where he says, I am the bread of life. Where he is the substance by which they survive. And he talks to them, he says, you think essentially that the bread that came down from heaven that sustained the people 40 years in the wilderness, you think Moses provided you that. He says, no. He says, God did. I am the bread of life. I sustain you. So we get here in chapter 8, and he says, I am the light. I am the light of the world. Jesus spoke to them again, I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. So what does that mean? What does that mean when he says, I am the light? So we have to look at what's going on right now in the book of John? What's happening right now? So at this particular time, what's happening is what's going on is called the Feast of Tabernacles. That's what's going on. If you were in our Leviticus class, we talked about that. So what is the Feast of Tabernacles? That's when they have certain ceremonies remembering what God did for the children of Israel as they were led out of Egypt and as he took care of them in the wilderness. One of the things they did was they would take water from the pool of Siloam, they would take it out, they would get next to the altar, and then they would pour it out. Why do you think they did that? Again, this is an interactive service. They did that to represent how God provided water for them in the wilderness. When God told him, okay, I want you to speak to the rock, and then later again Moses struck the rock, but nevertheless, water came out of the rock and God provided. That's what that represented. So around this time, when Christ says, I am the light, guess what's happening? There's these large candles that are placed in the inner courtyard that are just lit. Guess what that represents? As God guided the children of Israel out, guess what they followed at the nighttime? A pillar of fire. That pillar of fire, that light, is what guided them and led them to where they needed to go in the midst of darkness. Now, they were wandering through what we call the desert. Well, guess what? We have an advantage, I think, of understanding this passage because we live in the desert. And if you are away from the city and it's dark, guess what? It's dark. Unless you got all the bright shining stars in the sky to light your way, it's dark. And this is how God led his people, by the pillar of fire, by this pillar of light. And so when Christ says during this time, he says, I am the light of the world, guess what their minds go back to? He is essentially saying, as he did before Abraham was, I am. And then we talked about, he says, I am the good shepherd. He elevates himself over Moses. He elevates himself over David. And then he compares himself to the light guiding them in the wilderness. He says, I am that light. I am that light. And so I got to thinking about that. What is probably our very first introduction in the history of all creation to light? That's okay. I know it's early. You're all tired. Where? All right, come on. We got to know our Bible. Go back to Genesis chapter 1. Let's go to Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis chapter 1, we're going to start in verse 1. He says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light. So before there was light, what is the description of the state of things? There you go. The Bible says it was formless, it was empty, and it was dark. It was formless, it was empty, and it was dark. Now, keep in mind that passage. And keep in mind where Christ says, I am the light of the world. And then we go back to John 1:1, where he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The passage goes on to say that nothing was made without him. And he is the light that brings life to men. That's what that first passage in John chapter 1 says. Tie that all back into the fact when Christ says, I am the light. So what does light do? Let's look at the first one. The first one we talked about, it says that the earth was formless. So as light enters into this realm of creation, what was formless now has form, right? Now has form. The next thing that he says is it was empty. Emptiness existed before light stepped into creation. And then after emptiness, darkness. So as always, as Christ is speaking, he says, I am the light. How does that apply to me and you? Or for all our English teachers out there, how does that apply to you and I? How does that apply? Think about it for a moment. Christ says, I am the light of the world. If you don't have Christ in you, then you are formless. Which means you are not shaped and molded to where God wants to bring you. You ever try and work with a clump of clay that has no form? You know, you look at it, when I was in school and the teacher would bring out this it would be a square usually because they cut it off with a string, and they bring me this blob and they set it before me and they say, okay, go ahead and make something. I have no imagination to make anything. You want to know what I made? I looked at her and said, I'm done. She says, what do you mean? I made a square. God is not like that. When God shines a light on something, something that is formless, he now adds form to it, right? And I wonder, if God is shining a light into your life, are you letting him form you? Is God forming you? Is he shaping you? Is he molding you? Is he making you? Are you allowing God to do that in your life? Or are you shunning the light? The next thing he comes to, he says, formless and empty. Formless and empty. When Christ stepped into creation and light shone, then creation now is no longer empty because it's filled with light. We wonder sometimes, how do I walk through this earth dealing with all the things I have to deal with, whether it's family, finance, friends, marriage, whatever the case may be, and yet somehow inside I still am feeling empty, right? But you know, you're thinking to yourself, well, I shouldn't feel that way. I got a great hobby, I got a great job, I got a great family, and perhaps I've got a great marriage. But yet in some way, I'm still feeling a little empty. Well, the emptiness exists because there is no light there. Because where light shines, it's no longer empty, which is to say, if Christ is the light and he fills you up, then guess what? You're no longer empty. But if I'm still feeling drained, then I've got to examine, is the light of Christ actually inside me and filling me up? Now, don't beat yourself down if the answer is, okay, I'm not feeling that way. Then you know what? The light wants to come in. The light wants to come in because the next description is darkness, right? Darkness, emptiness, formless, and darkness, they all have these things in common, the same characteristics almost. Where darkness exists, well, darkness cannot exist in the presence of light. Not one bit. You ever been into a lighted room and you open the door to a dark room and then you feel all the darkness enter into the light room and it gets dark again? That don't happen. Physically does not happen. Scientifically does not happen. According to the laws of nature does not happen. Darkness does not overcome light. Matter of fact, when light is shown, what happens is it expels the darkness. That's what Christ does. And what do you think we battle almost on a daily basis? We battle darkness daily. Whether it is this inward struggle that Paul describes, or whether it's contending earnestly for the faith. Darkness exists, and Christ came as the light to expel the darkness. So I've got to decide, is the light living in me? If I am overcome by the darkness, then I need to let his light shine. And you might say to yourself, well, Raymond, that's an easy thing to say, but a hard thing to do. Sometimes it can be. Sometimes it can be. What that requires is for us to draw closer to God. Remember that analogy about the shark and the dolphin? The dolphin wants to come close. God is always desiring to come close to his people. And guess what? The closer the light gets to you, the closer you draw to God and he draws near to you, guess what happens to the darkness? The further it goes away, the further it goes away, the further it goes away. So I don't really have to wonder, how do I resolve this issue of darkness heading into my life? I just got to examine, how close am I getting to God? And it's not really a distance kind of thing. It's a matter of, am I growing in my faith and am I drawing near to the one that created me? And we know what those things are. Am I spending time in prayer? Am I spending time in study? Am I spending time in fellowship with one another? Am I doing those things that draw me closer to God and in turn draws God closer to me so that this darkness can be dispelled? Sometimes we may wonder, well, I don't know how we actually are going to accomplish that in this world. Because let's be honest, sometimes you turn on your news and this world can be pretty bad, right? So what do we do? What do we do? I want to go to a passage that most of us are probably already familiar with. Let's go to Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah 29. You hear this verse quoted and touted again and again and again, but I want to look at it a little more closely this morning. In light of the light of Jesus Christ that we were talking about this morning. Here in Jeremiah 29, he says in verse 11, "For I know the plans I have for you." This is the Lord's declaration. Plans for your well-being, not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope. Wow. Isn't that amazing? He said, I know the plans I have for you. A plans to give you a future, a plans to give you hope. I'm not here to bring you disaster. Matter of fact, it's the opposite. I'm here to bring you hope. You know what's interesting about this passage? As it's being penned, it's in the middle of a chapter, which is probably not a chapter you really use for devotions, nor is Jeremiah a book you use for that. Why? They're in the middle of captivity in Babylon. That's where they are. In the midst of their captivity, God calls out to them. He says, I've got a plan for you. So in a bad chapter, in a down book, he gives a good verse that I've got plans to prosper you, to bring you hope, to give you a future. In the middle of their captivity. You know, if God can promise that to his people then, I promise you he can give it to us now. We live in a society and in a culture where they want to call wrong right all the time. And what we need to do is stand up, as Christ says in Matthew chapter 5, be the light of the world. Well, see, our light is only a reflection of Jesus Christ. I can only reflect. But I've got to do that in this generation. I've got to do that in this culture. I've got to do that in my community. I've got to do that in my society. I have to be the light. I've got to reflect the light that Christ shines. Because guess what? How many of you like being around sad and mopey people? If you do, I've got a number for you. We generally, that is not who we gravitate to unless we ourselves are sad and mopey. Well, guess what? I'm not really a sad and mopey guy. But here's the thing. Why not? Because I got the light of Jesus Christ living inside me. And so what I want to do is grab as many people as I can to experience this light. So if we want more of our community to shine, we start with our home, we start with our neighborhood, we start with our city, we start with our county, and now you get the gist of it, right? And it radiates out. We need to be a reflection of the light of Jesus Christ. Because that light, as we talked about earlier, well, the children of Israel were in the wilderness and the pillar of fire guided them. Guess who guides us? The light of Jesus Christ. The light of Jesus Christ. He not only illuminates me on the inside, but he illuminates on the outside. Well, so when he says, I am the light of the world, make no mistake of what he's saying. He says, I am the God who gives life. I am the God who leads. I am the God who guides. I am the God that dispels the darkness that exists. Prior to this is a little bit what we're going to talk about in chapter 7. If you go back to John chapter 8, you back up a little bit in John chapter 7. I believe this is where many of us are sometimes. In John chapter 7, what happens is, leading up to Christ saying, I am the light of the world, the Pharisees and this group of people, they bring to Jesus, and they kind of, the way I picture it in my mind, they kind of cast this woman down at his feet, and they say, hey, this woman was caught up in adultery. The law says that we should stone her. And I kind of picture that woman that they grabbed and brought before Christ. I don't really picture her standing up, being defiant like this. No, the law legitimately said that she could be stoned. So the picture I have in mind is, if you're going to stone me, I'm going to cover up like this, and she's probably covered up like this in a ball on the ground. And we remember that story because Christ kneels down. He writes something in the sand. In essence, his response is, he says, you know what? Let the first one of you without sin cast the first stone. As he gets up, guess where everybody went? They left. They walked away. Christ then turns to the lady. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Sometimes when Christ says, neither do I condemn you, and he kind of washes our slate clean, for some reason we stay curled up on the ground in a ball. And that's not where he wants us. Because when light truly comes into your life, you don't have to huddle in fear anymore. Well, sometimes as we're children, as we grow up, we have this fear of the dark, right? And as adults, sometimes we kind of stumble through our room as we get up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I get up for Elias and I won't turn on the light. I figure, hey, I know where I'm going. And sometimes I just don't, and I'll hit my foot at the edge of the bed, and it's usually my pinky toe. And that hurts. But don't worry, all the words coming out of my mouth are holy. It's all right. But why? Because it's dark, and darkness causes you to stumble. Darkness causes pain. Darkness causes hurt. But guess what? You flip on that light, I can see where I'm going. And Christ is trying to tell you, flip on the light, which is me. Why? So you can see where you're going. And guess what happens when you can see where you're going? You don't have to hurt anymore. You don't have to stumble in the dark. Right? Flip on the light. He says, I am the light of the world. Christ came into this world so that light would dispel this darkness. Darkness is a whole lot of things. The darkness of sin. Don't even discount it. The darkness of death. He says, I am the light of the world. If you want to be lifted out of this cloud of darkness that you're in, then there's but one answer, and that's Jesus Christ. He must illuminate you both inside and illuminate the outside. It's interesting, I got to thinking about it. Our sun goes to sleep at night, right? Kind of like our phones. No, it's okay. Science class now, guys. It does not. Just because it gets dark doesn't mean someone flipped a switch and the sun went off. The sun is always burning, okay? But we experience darkness, why? Because the earth rotates. And on our side, when we experience darkness, because the earth has rotated, turned away from the sun. And now there's no longer light shining, and so we are in darkness. Guess what happens when you turn away from the sun? There's no longer light, and you live in darkness. And that is not as where God is calling you. He's calling you to turn towards Him so that you can live in the light of the Son of God. If you are here this morning and you have never named the name of Christ, you have never been buried with Christ in baptism and risen to walk in a new life, then we encourage you to do so, because the Bible says that is the only way. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And our baptism is a representation of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. If you have not done so, we encourage you to come. If you have wandered away and you're like that lady caught up in adultery, where even after God has said, neither do I condemn you, and you are still huddled up in a ball on the floor, He's telling you, get up. Get up. Come to me. Go and sin no more. He will walk with you, and so will we. If we can pray for you in any way or help you in any way, please come forward as together we stand and together we sing.